Several other videos in this series show how to refresh a pivot table in the context of their topics. But just in case you missed it, the current video provides all the information you need to know about refreshing. You need to refresh whenever data in the underlying data source change. As explained in the pivot cache video, a pivot table is based on a snapshot of the original data, and this snapshot is stored in the pivot cache. If you change data in the original data source, the pivot cache doesn't update automatically. You have to refresh it, and this updates the pivot table with the newest data. I will again use the online purchases dataset for illustration. I have already created a typical pivot table. Now I will change a value in the dataset by a huge amount and return to the pivot table. As you can see, it hasn't changed. However, it does change when I click the Refresh button on the Pivot Table Tools Analyze ribbon. Another time refreshing is required is when a pivot table is based on an Excel table. To illustrate this, I will delete the pivot table, create a table on the datasheet, and create a new pivot table based on the table. As explained in the companion video, Pivot Tables Based on a Table, the pivot table changes automatically if the table expands with new rows and/or new columns. Well, this isn't quite true. It has to be refreshed. Here's an illustration where I will create a new column in the table, which becomes part of the table. That's the total amount you would spend without the savings. Then I will refresh to see the new field in the fields list. As you might have noticed, there is a drop-down list for the refresh button. The first item is chosen if you simply click the refresh button, as I have been doing. It refreshes the selected pivot table. More precisely, it refreshes the pivot cache that the pivot table is based on. If other pivot tables are based on the same pivot cache, they are refreshed as well. The Refresh All item is for situations where there are multiple pivot tables based on multiple pivot caches. Then this item refreshes all of them. There is one other refresh option you should be aware of. Suppose your pivot table is based on an external data source, such as a SQL Server database, that changes daily. Every morning, your boss opens the pivot table workbook you have created for her, but she might not know to click the refresh button. You can make this automatic so that a refresh occurs every time the workbook is opened. You do this from the Data tab in the Pivot Table Options dialog box. Actually, if you have different pivot tables in the same workbook, based on different pivot caches, you have to change this setting for each of them. Then you can save the workbook to save these settings. Now your boss will see the newest data every morning.